Director of the Ohio Department of Public Safety and co-chair of this task force. And at this point, I would like to convene the Ohio Task Force on Community Police Relations and welcome everyone. Welcome to task force members. I also want to thank our co-chair, Senator Turner, honorary co-chairs who are with us today, the Honorable Congressman Stokes, the Honorable Mr. Anthony Munoz, and all the task force members for both your devotion of time and energy into this very important matter. At this point, what I'd like to do is ask each of the task force members, beginning with Senator Williams on the far right, to introduce themselves, who they represent, and then we will shortly move into some opening remarks by the Honorable Congressman Stokes, Mr. Munoz, and then turn it over to Senator Turner for remarks for this business portion of the task force. Senator Williams.
Thank you, Director Bourne. My name is Sandra Williams. I want to say good afternoon to all of you. Right now, I represent the 21st Senate District in Ohio, which is both the east and the west sides of Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Newburgh Heights, University Heights, Cleveland Heights, and Bracknell. Thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Derrickson, representing the Ohio House, 53rd District, which is in Butler County in southwest Ohio.
My name is Phil Cole. I represent the Ohio Association of Community Action Agencies.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Roberts. I've served 20 years in the Ohio General Assembly. The governor appointed me to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, so I'm a member of the Civil Rights Commission, but I'm also the Ohio NAACP Conference Political Action Chair.
Good afternoon. Detective Brian Armstead with the Akron Police Department, and I'm here as a member of the Fraternal Order of Police Ohio.
I'm Louis Stokes, retired member of the United States Congress. I served in that body for 30 years. I'm pleased to be on the task force.
I'm Senator Hyde, 1st District, 11 counties up in northwest Ohio, and they call me Coach.
Andre Porter, Director of the Ohio Department of Commerce and Governor's Designee.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Murray. I'm on Cincinnati City Council, and I'm representing the municipalities.
Good afternoon. I'm Ronnie Dunn, Associate Professor of Urban Studies here at Cleveland State and a member of the local chapter of the NAACP Criminal Justice Committee.
My name is Bernie Marino. I live here in Westlake, Ohio, and I'm going to be in the task force. I have a business here that I run. And I think from my perspective, somebody who lives in the suburbs, I think what's important is to understand this issue affects everybody, not just people in the cities.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Navarre. I'm with the Oregon Police Division, where I'm currently the chief. I spent 34 years in Toledo before I went to the Oregon Police Division, and I am representing the Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police.
Thank you, Chief. Good afternoon. My name is Ron O'Brien. I'm the Franklin County Prosecuting Attorney, which is the city of Columbus, the capital. I'm representing the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association, the group of 88 county prosecutors across the state.
My name is Sarah Andrews, and I'm the designee for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Ohio.
I'm representing the Buckeye State Sheriff's Association. I'm Vernon Stanforth. I'm the Sheriff of Fayette County, Ohio. I also serve as chairman of the Ohio Peace Officers Training Commission.
He's from Cincinnati, Ohio, 33rd District, and president of Ohio Legislative Black Caucus.
And my name is Damon Lynch, pastor of New Prospect Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I just represent the citizens.
Congressman Stokes, would you like to open a few remarks?
Thank you, Director Bourne. And let me just firstly say that I'm honored to serve on this task force along with former Senator George Voinovich and the other co-chairs, other honorary co-chairs who've been appointed to this task force. It's also an honor for me to serve with you and with Senator Turner as co-chairs of this task force. I accepted the governor's invitation to be a part of this task force because I believe in the work that this task force can do. We are currently in a crisis throughout our nation with reference to police-community relations. In every major city in America, there are demonstrations and protests. And I'm just pleased that in our state, our governor is trying to do something about this national crisis. I think that this task force, through the executive order of the governor, has a specific mission, and I think if we fulfill the governor's order, which says for us to conduct hearings around the state and then issue a report giving the governor recommendations in terms of action to be taken, and provide him the opportunity through those recommendations to try and change conditions in our state. So I'm pleased to be a part of it, and I look forward to working with all of you on this very distinguished panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. It's now my honor to introduce another honorary co-chair, the Honorable Anthony Munoz.
Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Munoz, and I'm actually an old retired NFL football player from the team down in the southern part of the state. So, team that wears the stripes. So, I appreciate the opportunity to be in this great community tonight. It is really an honor, and I'm very humbled to be part of this task force. It is amazing that I sit up here with all of these individuals knowing that we will make a change, lead the charge, not only in this state, but I truly believe we can make a difference here in this state and take it nationally. So it is an honor to be part of this task force, and I appreciate it, and with great humility, I want to serve.
Thank you, Director, and good afternoon to everyone. And just to echo the sentiments of everyone that has spoken, it is an honor and a pleasure to serve, and all of us up here this afternoon, we are here for public service. And to have the Congressman as one of the honorary co-chairs, Mr. Munoz, and Justice Stratton, who's not here today, but it is such a pleasure. I want you all to know that when we come together in this way, whether you're part of the community or you're one of the members that are here to serve the task force, if we come here with the intention to have a great outcome, that will happen. Representative or Senator Williams and I, along with Representative Reese, had the opportunity to meet with the governor to talk about concerns, the concerns that are being felt in this community and all across this country. And Senator Williams and I keep saying representative because when we were working on this, we've been working on this for quite a long time in the legislature, along with, and I have to give a shout out to Dr. Ronnie Dunn, who has been right by our side as we have been trying to figure out ways in which to ameliorate these challenges that are happening in our community, predominantly in communities of color, and more particularly in the African American community. It definitely takes teamwork to make the dream work. And when the three of us went to see the governor after letters were written by myself and then Senator Williams and I, it didn't take the governor long to know that he needed to step in and to do something about this. And in that meeting, that same day, the governor of this state had his chief of staff, he had his director of boards and commissions, he had his communications team. Before we left that meeting on that day, the governor said, I will create this task force. That is both beautiful and powerful at the same time. And the very next day, we had a press conference and the executive order had not even been written. So I tell you that story to say that when people come together for causes that are bigger and greater than themselves, there's no mountain high enough, there's no valley low enough There's nothing wide enough to stop good-intentioned people from doing the right thing. And the governor had the power of executive order, and that's exactly what he has done. And he has tasked this commission with traveling the state, collecting the information and input, the feelings of the community, and taking those thoughts and feelings and ideas from the wide swath of community members, be they Ms. Jones down the street or the police officer that serves in a suburban or urban community, to bring those thoughts together to make recommendations to the governor that are actionable. Now, I got to tell you, for Colonel Bourne and I don't know if it was quite a shock for the director, I always call him Colonel, that when the governor said he wanted to get this done in 3 months, and the reason why he wanted to do it so quickly is because the budget will be debated in the Ohio General Assembly, and he wanted the recommendations from this task force to be actionable, and that is what all of us want. So it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to continue to serve in this way. We are doing nation building in this state right now, and as the congressman said, this has not been done anywhere in the country, so we should be proud, and we should not let what we cannot do get in the way of what we can do. And right now, we can use this moment in time to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I think Ms. Bell may have been well. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. My name is Tanisha Bell. I'm with Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine's office. I am the Chief of the Crime Victim Services Section.
Welcome. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Carlton Moore, who is the Executive Director of the Ohio Office of Criminal Justice Services. He and his staff have put a lot of work in a short period of time into making this happen, as well as the governor's staff. Certainly appreciate his leadership, his efforts. He's going to take it from here and be the task force facilitator, not only for the rest of this portion of the business meeting of the task force, but also lead us into the public forum and the presentations.
All right, thank you, Director. As you heard the Director say, my name is Carlton Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Office of Criminal Justice Services. I'm not an actual member of the task force. I'm a facilitator for the task force. I, along with my staff, will be staffing all of the task force meetings. I'd like right now to make a recommendation that I speak before Senator Turner speaks at every meeting from this day forward. But my staff will be staffing this, and you can see a few of them. There's Jim Loopers here. If you need anything while we're here, please let me know, and my staff can help you with that. This is the business meeting for anyone who has just walked in. Our meetings are public, so that means even the boring things that we have to talk about, and when I talk, there will be some boring things that I will talk about. Those things have to be in the light of the public eye. But I do want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the task force members for agreeing to be a part of this very important task force. The executive order lays out the framework under which we operate. The mandates of the executive order are that we will hold 4 public forums. We currently have 4 scheduled. We're obviously here at Cleveland State today, January 20th, but we currently have 3 other forums scheduled. February 9th at Central State University, February 25th in Toledo, and March 10th in Cincinnati. We still have a lot of work to do on each one of those events, so if there's any member of the task force who would like to be a part of the planning for those events, I would certainly appreciate your assistance and guidance. I do want to stress that the executive order requires us to do 4. And as I said, it lays out the framework. It lets us know that our work must be done with our public forums no later than March 31st, and that we have to complete a report that we will submit to the governor. That report has to be completed by April 30th. The other decisions on the way the task force operates, whether the task force wants to hold additional public meetings, that is up to this task force. As I said, the executive order lays down the framework. This is your task force, and you have the opportunity to shape it as you see fit. So let me get to some of the boring things. We do have lunch. Actually, it's a dinner, but it's really a lunch that we're passing off as a dinner. We have that available to you all. As you would imagine with bureaucracy, you must sign for the lunch. So we have proof to auditors that you received your lunch/dinner. If you do not sign off on the lunch, then you never received it, even if I visually watch you eat it right in front of me. So if you do take a lunch slash dinner, please sign off on that. We will operate under Robert's Rules of Orders. If we need to, if that's necessary, the chairs will control the flow of the meeting. If you have questions, they will recognize you. We will shortly, when we start the public portion of the meeting, we will have testimony from the U.S. Attorney and from David Kennedy. And if you would like to ask them questions, all you have to do is raise your hand. You'll be recognized by the chairs, and then you can proceed with asking your question. Our plan right now, we have a giant clock down here on the floor. Depending on the turnout, once we start testimony, we will most likely start testimony around 6:20 to 6:30. Once we do that, if this room is filled, we will limit testimony to 3 minutes. Jim Loopers at that time will probably be the most unpopular person in the room because he's in charge of the clock. And so he will signal to us when 3 minutes is over. If we have time for everyone to speak, or if it looks like we don't have an overflowing crowd, the chairs are willing to allow people to go longer than 3 minutes. But we will find out at some point how many people we have here who want to testify, and we will make that recommendation to the chair at that time. I want to remind the task force members that emails, communications among the task force members, to my staff, to the director about the business of the task force are public records. And if we receive a public records request, that information would be turned over. So I would urge everyone to be mindful of that as the task force goes about its work. Inside of an envelope, you all should have an envelope at your place here at the table. There's information on travel reimbursement and other things. There's numbers and names of people you can call about travel reimbursement. Please call those folks. Do not call me about travel reimbursement. They can take care of that for you. So if you have any questions on those particular issues surrounding travel reimbursement, please refer to the numbers that are provided to you. Just want to go over the schedule once again. We will start with a short welcome from the President of Cleveland State. I want to thank Cleveland State for hosting us. This is a wonderful facility, and we appreciate the hospitality of Cleveland State greatly. Once the President does his welcome, we will then hear from Steve Dettelbach, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, and then from David Kennedy. That should run until about 6:20 to 6:30. We will then at that time take a short break, and then we will come back and listen to public testimony. Does anyone have any questions? All right, that means I did everything exactly right then. So I'll turn it back over to the chairs.
Thank you, Director Moore. I believe President Berkman from Cleveland State University is here. President Berkman, it would be an honor if you could come up to the podium and say a few remarks about your wonderful university and this great facility. And we certainly appreciate the hospitality that we've been shown and the professionalism that Carlton and his staff have been afforded leading up to this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me first say that I'm not going to stay for dinner. So let it be recorded that I did not receive a dinner. I want to welcome everyone here for this community forum on the Cleveland State University campus. And I want to thank the men and women who are sitting here on this stage today, who have been appointed by Governor Kasich to serve our state in this incredibly important capacity at this extremely important time. I want to recognize some of the Northeast Ohio Task Force members. I don't see Senator Voinovich, but Congressman Lou Stokes, serving as one of the honorary co-chairs, I have to mention that he's a CSU alum, of course, as well as a 20-term alum of the U.S. House of Representatives. Senator Nina Turner, who is the co-chair. Just by chance, she happens to be a CSU alum as well. We're now 2 for 2. Senator Turner, thank you for everything you do for the university, for the community, and for taking on this extraordinarily important task. Senator Sandra Williams, I have to mention that she's a CSU. We really didn't plan this. I didn't appoint the committee, but Senator Williams is a CSU alum as well. And finally, Bernie Moreno, who is not a CSU alum, but happens to be a member of the CSU Board of Trustees, and of course, Professor Ronnie Dunn, an associate professor at CSU. So again, I want to have a special shout out to those from the North. But I want to again thank those who are participating, those who are here today. And I'm glad, and it's such an important opportunity for us to use a college campus, a venue really dedicated to free speech, a venue dedicated to bringing communities together, an opportunity for there to be a neutral platform and for the community to have access to this facility and to this task force. So what is happening today is very much consistent with who we are as a university, who we aspire to be, what we want to demonstrate to our students, and we are in fact honored to have you here in this beautiful facility, and I wish that the task force has a productive exchange today and moves this dialogue forward for the residents of the state of Ohio. Thank you very much.
I just want to say to the task force members, we will not be taking a break until we hear the presentations from the U.S. Attorney and from David Kennedy. So if you need to take a phone call or spend some time in the back area, please feel free to do that. First want to introduce Steve Dettelbach. He was nominated by President Obama on July 10, 2009, and unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate on September 15, 2009 as United States Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. He comes to his position as Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the northern 40 counties of Ohio with a wealth of varied experience. And as you can imagine, Steve has a very long bio, but I just want to say I've had the great opportunity to work with Steve over the years. I've certainly enjoyed working with him. He runs a very professional staff, and I feel very fortunate and honored that he can join us here today and be the very first presenter to our task force. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you very, very much, Carlton, and thank you to the co-chair people, to Senator Turner and Director Warren, who I've worked with on many things. I want to thank you for chairing this task force and to the members of the task force for your leadership in examining the critical and difficult issues that face our state and here our community in Cleveland and indeed the nation. Issues of constitutional policing and building police community trust both ways. These issues are central not only to public safety, but to officer safety. And forums like this one are critical to address the issues that face police forces and communities that are all over our communities in our state today. These are issues that are of profound interest to the Department of Justice. And as you know, this fall, Attorney General Holder launched the Department of Justice National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, which will create a substantial investment in training, evidence-based strategies, policy development, and research to combat distrust and hostility between law enforcement and communities that they serve. Attorney General Holder has also hosted several field hearings around the country, as you are doing here in Ohio, including here in Cleveland last month around the same topic. Mr. Chair, I don't know what the procedure is, but to the co-chairs, I would ask that I could submit my remarks, full extent of my remarks in writing, and that may enable me to be a little more truncated here in the oral part and take questions and take comments from the panel, which is probably a better thing to do. I want to begin by saying what I hope and expect that everybody here, this panel, understands as a starting point for this, is that I feel we need to publicly repeat that we need to express our incredible respect and gratitude for those who work in law enforcement as police officers, including members of the Cleveland Division of Police. And one of the reasons I'm here is to talk a little bit about what's going on in Cleveland. It's very important to start with that statement. I've been a prosecutor for many years, not quite as long as Prosecutor O'Brien, close. And I can tell you firsthand, as many of you know who wear the badge here, as Chief Navarre can tell you, that policing is a dangerous and difficult job. And it's probably more dangerous and more difficult today than it has been ever. So we need to make sure that we let the police know that we owe them our thanks. But in order for any community to thrive, we also have to acknowledge, as you are doing here, that we can't sweep problems under the rug. And that goes especially for the most difficult of problems. Because when states, when communities ignore these kinds of problems, they grow. They grow from problems and crises. They threaten our success, they threaten our basic rights, and they can even threaten our public safety. That's why we have to address them, as you are here, head on. That's also why last March I stood with then Assistant Attorney General Tom Perez, with our Mayor, Frank Jackson, and with then Police Chief Mike McGrath, and we announced the beginning of a comprehensive investigation by the Department of Justice into whether or not the Cleveland Division of Police engages in a pattern and practice of the excessive use of force. Now, we didn't start our investigation in response to any one or two particular incidents. We did it because of a series of things that had happened over time. And we also did it in response to requests that came from all corners of this city. The clergy, civil rights organizations, elected officials, and, importantly, Mayor Jackson himself requested that we come and conduct this investigation here. The process we engaged in over the 20-month period of our investigation was a public one, and it was a collaborative one. And it was one where we had communication frequently with the chief, with people in the police department, people at the city, and that was on display last month when we announced our findings by the fact that Mayor Jackson was there standing with us. And I was very pleased that Mayor Jackson and the Department of Justice agreed to a statement of principles with a plan for moving forward on the same day we issued our findings, chief among them, that while we still have a long way to go, that the city would agree that a consent decree with the independent federal monitor was the way to address the issues that we found in Cleveland. I believe that in this case, in every situation, in every community, in every department is different. In this case, a court-enforceable agreement for reform with outside oversight was essential. Essential both for making and maintaining positive change within the Cleveland Division of Police. We also delivered a 58-page letter of findings to the mayor that day. And you have access to that document. It's been provided to you. It informed him that we found, indeed, the Cleveland Division of Police did engage in a pattern of practice of using excessive force. Now, I tell you that we, and I at a very personal level, take no joy in this finding. But I also tell you that, I say this as somebody who works with police officers and has for 2 decades, that in this particular case it was supported by a vast amount of the evidence. For over 20 months, a team of individuals that were comprised of lawyers, former police executives, and current police officers, people from the Civil Rights Division, people from the U.S. Attorney's Office, went through thousands upon thousands of pages of documents, reviewed hundreds and hundreds of use of force reports and incidents, met with police officers, met with command staff, met with the mayor, met with people from the community, interviewed individuals, had an open phone line, an email system where people could send in information, waded through all this information, conclusions that are outlined in the report. It was exhaustive, it was inclusive, and it was fair. The letter is thorough, and it offers a great deal of detail regarding the issues that we identified. As we said, we concluded that there was reasonable cause to believe that the Cleveland Police engaged in a pattern of unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Specifically, we made 4 underlying more specific findings to support that general finding. One related to the unnecessary use of deadly force, including specifically head strikes with impact weapons and shootings. The head strikes with the impact weapon is one of the more interesting and troubling findings because too often we found that it was head strikes with firearms, which, as most police officers will tell you, is something that just shouldn't be happening if officers are tactically approaching the situations correctly. We found that there was less lethal force that was being used in pattern practice of unreasonable ways. Specifically, we talked about tasers and chemical sprays and fists. I think with tasers, one of the issues that I thought was interesting was that, back when tasers first came out, a decade ago, they were sort of viewed as one of these technological fixes that was going to resolve everything, right? It was going to give officers another option so that they weren't going to have to use more violent means, more deadly force. And as happens with many of these technological fixes, and I think this is something that you should focus on going forward, people fall in love with the technology and sometimes they ignore some of the underlying issues. So what was happening in this particular department was that officers had been trained on tasers and they were using the taser as a first resort too often, as if it was not the application of force at all. And I think that was in some ways a natural reaction to the idea of how tasers came on the scene in law enforcement. I say that not to pick on the taser, but I say that because every time one of these debates start, people start talking about the technology, whatever it is, that time that's going to fix these problems. And technology is important. Technology needs to be current, but technology does not resolve these kinds of underlying problems in itself. The next thing we found was a pattern and practice of excessive force against persons who are mentally ill and in crisis. And these included instances where police aren't even called for criminal activity, but are called for service because, let's say somebody has a relative who has a mental disability and has locked themselves in the bathroom. And we found all too often what was happening is police officers were responding and doing things to escalate that situation as opposed to de-escalating. Now, these are very difficult situations for police officers to respond to. And they point, I think, in general to the need for the most current training to equip officers with things that they need in their training and in their background to deal with these kind of difficult situations. And finally, we talked about what we found to be poor and dangerous tactics that sometimes place officers at risk, sometimes place the community at risk, and sometimes led to the unreasonable use of force. There were not only the findings, as I outlined them for you, of what we found happened retrospectively, but we tried in our findings letter to also identify what we thought were some of the core causes of these things, so that immediately moving forward, we could try to work with the city together hand in hand to try and address some of these problems. So we didn't just look for symptoms. We didn't try to play the blame game. Instead, we looked for causes. And I'll go through a couple with you. One of them was we found that there needed to be better accountability in general, and for the unreasonable use of force in particular at the Cleveland Division of Police. We found that force incidents were too often not properly reported, documented, investigated, or addressed with corrective measures. And when accountability falters, so often does trust in the community. Two of the more troubling parts of our findings were things that people who actually worked in the city of Cleveland in the process of evaluating and investigating these use of force incidents told us. One of them was that they sought to portray these incidents in a way that was slanted towards the officer's side version of something that they told people who were just investigating the matter. And the second was when asked what the standards that they were applying for these kinds of incidents, all but one of the people interviewed said that they were using a beyond reasonable doubt standard to apply to internal discipline, which points to a lack of understanding of the difference between the criminal process and the disciplinary process. Of course, the beyond a reasonable doubt standard is also the same criminal law notice that's used in criminal cases. It's not the standard that's used in internal disciplinary matters in employment decisions, those kinds of processes. The second thing that we found was that community policing strategies are not sufficiently embedded in the Cleveland Division of Police. Indeed, as our report states, many frontline patrol officers really couldn't even accurately explain what community policing meant. And those dedicated officers that are engaging in community policing, and there are many officers in Cleveland, and of course in many departments, but in Cleveland is what I'm talking about, are engaging in community policing, but they're sort of doing it on their own accord because they care. By the way, police officers do care. So these officers are out there doing this at their own accord, but it's really not part of their job function, they told us. It's sort of the extra thing they do on top of the normal thing that they're supposed to do as police officers. And we found that the City of Cleveland, the Cleveland Division of Police, needs to have a community policing strategy and plan. It doesn't just leave it up to officer preference as to whether or not they engage in community policing. And then last, we found that there are significant issues with respect to the resources that are provided to officers in the Cleveland Division of Police to equip them to do the very difficult and dangerous job that they have to do every day. We found that they're not often accorded with the appropriate training, and we need to work a lot on training. And sometimes the actual equipment that they're afforded with and the structure, the infrastructure of the police department is simply inadequate. It's a very difficult problem that faces many municipalities, but it's especially acute here in Cleveland. And I'd ask you, as you consider going forward, things that you can do. I mean, I serve half the state of Ohio, but these problems are particularly acute here in Cleveland, Ohio. Officers are oftentimes riding in cars that aren't equipped with the most basic computer-assisted dispatch, the CAD system. Officers are using their own cell phones as opposed to police communications, often because the police communication system is inadequate. Officers are afforded initial training at the police academy, but are not afforded sufficient in-service training. That would be something that I think would be a really constructive role for OPATA. I know the Attorney General has also talked about working on that. And quite frankly, some of the infrastructure in the actual places where the police officers go to work is simply just a difficult workplace to go to. And you know, it's hard to expect year in and year out that a police officer, you know, we expect to be the consummate professional. It's hard to really expect year in and year out if you ask that person to go to work in some of the settings that we saw. If you ask that person to use the kind of equipment that we saw, it's hard to really expect anything else than that person is not going to be able to, over the long run, maintain the idealism and the enthusiasm that they came into policing with at the beginning of their careers. It's hard to believe it's not going to affect them when they respond to those most difficult calls at 2 in the morning out on the street. We need to do part of this equation, needs to be supporting the police department. Now that's difficult because times are tough for most municipalities on the budget front. And difficult choices have to be made. And I recognize that these are balancing decisions that need to be made by the electable and accountable officials. But I guess what I would say is I am a proud Clevelander. I grew up here. I would point out, Mr. Munoz, that you scored one of your only touchdowns here in this city. But every bit as much as the Republican National Convention, or the new hotels we're building here, or the casino, or the new scoreboard, or LeBron James, every bit as important as all of those assets is our investment in the asset of a constitutional, effective, and well-equipped police department in this city. It is an asset to protect the future of the city. It's an asset to protect the rights of the residents. And it, in many ways, defines as a democracy who we are as a nation and as a community. It separates us from other nations and communities. So I'll end just by briefly saying that I work with many, many police departments officers who go into policing, people who go into policing, including at the Cleveland Division of Police, do so for the right reasons. They want to help people, they want to protect people. And those who would force a dichotomy between acknowledging that and judging the actions of some of the police officers, I think, are painting a false dichotomy. In this nation, we need to be able to both acknowledge that fact, to thank officers, but also, when the facts dictate it, to hold officers and communities and police departments accountable for what happens in them. And we need to also make sure that communities understand that they need to also respect the officers who are policing the community. It's a two-way street here. So I'll end there and submit the rest of my comments for the record, and I would be glad to answer any questions if that's appropriate, Mr. and Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gatterback, both for your testimony, and we'd be glad to accept your written testimony and work with your staff to get that. Are there any questions from the task force members for him? Bertie?
Question on that as you discussed. How do you see where the police are put in situations where they're having to deal with mental health issues, which isn't normally something that's a charter, so to speak, of a police officer? And then there's also the other piece of it, which is to be effective in community policing. I happen to have a business also in Boston. I was talking to Commissioner Davis the last few days in advance of this task force. And one of the things he mentioned is clearly police officers never deliver great news. They don't pull you over to give you the winning lottery number. And the idea that you're, as a community resident, always seeing the police in a negative light, and yet sometimes there's municipalities and cities that have policies and procedures that lead to over-ticketing and where there's a lot of fines being put out, and there's this negativity that already exists that's made worse by those situations.
Right, so, and the second one was community policing, and the first one was, what was the first one?
That you're having the police having to deal with a lot of mental health issues.
So on the mental health point, these are really difficult situations, and one of the things that we found in Cleveland was that there's a highly effective training that is offered to police officers, CIT training, crisis intervention training. Bill Denahan was here earlier. He's the head of our Adams board here. They run this training. Almost every officer who took this training, who talked to us, said it was the single best training they had ever taken as a police officer. But it's a 40-hour training. And what we found was that all too often the officers who were responding to these incidents, these very difficult, challenging incidents, are not the same people who have taken the training. It doesn't do any good to have a really great training course if the people who are responding to the call aren't the ones who got the training. And so I think there's an issue with respect to not just training, having the training, but then the issue of resource allocation. It's a management issue. It's how to manage your workforce appropriately to make sure that the product is actually delivered appropriately to the consumers. On the point about community policing, so there are a lot of efforts in the city, as I'm sure there are in many of the municipalities where you work. I'm sure there are in Cincinnati, right, where there are a bunch of community meetings. Commanders are out there, every Tuesday night, I'm sure in Columbus, meeting with the people in the community. They go to the rec center, people show up. The leadership of the city, the mayor, the chief, are very, very focused on reaching out to the community. Okay, so at a programmatic level, there's a lot of really good, important work that needs to be acknowledged. The problem is, as somebody mentioned before, okay, it's not Chief Williams or Steve Dettelbach who responds at 2 in the morning when a call happens in a dangerous neighborhood. And too often, we're viewing community policing as just the job of kind of management and not something that is baked into the everyday job performance expectations of the officer. Now, you're right. Police officers often deliver really bad news, and they justifiably both use force many times, as they should and have to, and arrest people as they should and have to. But what we found in Cleveland was too often that police officers and the community just they view themselves the police officers sort of view the community as a hostile territory, right? When they leave the bay, they drive out of the bay of the department in their vehicles, they're sort of driving into somebody else's territory. And they don't view themselves often enough as members of the community themselves. And so you're right, but you're never going to have a situation where police officers are going to sort of arrest people who are going to win popularity contests. That's not the goal. The goal, and I think we shouldn't sell the community short. I think people in the community get that. Most people in difficult communities where high crime rates exist want the police there, need the police there maybe more than you and I do in our communities. But they expect, because the vast majority of them are law-abiding citizens who are living in a difficult place, they expect to be treated with respect, and they deserve to be treated.
Thank you, Mr. Moreno. Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mike, you had mentioned in-service, and I want to thank you for your presentation. I'm a former professional educator, 30 years, and in-service can be a very valuable resource, and it can be very invaluable. It depended. When you went through that process of suggestion, because I think it's a great idea, did you have some specific areas that you think would be the programs or programs that are available here or throughout the country? And I also wanted to just mention this. I'm an old history teacher as well. And I think history is an important part of what we do here. I think it's an extremely important part. So people get a better understanding of why things are the way they are. And I didn't know if that fit into that, but I don't think you had specifics. I didn't know in your report if you had specifics or not.
So with respect to focusing on Cleveland, I mean, the number one thing I would point out that we mentioned in our report is the actual CIT training, the crisis intervention training. And then in addition, we talk a lot about tactical training. The fact that officers simply probably need more tactical training as to how to deal with difficult, dangerous situations so that they are not putting themselves in positions of risk and not putting the arrestee in positions of risk. But for every department, that's going to be different. I think the key is that it's really a management point. For those of you who have private sector experience, right? This is a management point, which is when you are looking at a department, what you should be doing is there should be a constant loop between the reports that are coming in for use of force, the complaints that are coming in, individual officers and units, and you should be doing a constant loop as to, all right, are we getting a lot of people who are complaining about head strikes with a gun? Are we getting a lot of people who are complaining about rudeness, maybe not even a violation that's a criminal violation or civil violation, rudeness? And then what are we doing if we're seeing an uptick in something? We have to readjust our training and focus our training onto those particular places in the city and those parts of the department that need a particular kind of training. And that's something we didn't find was going on, but it's really, I think, from a police executive standpoint, for the chiefs and sheriffs, it's what they really get paid to do, is they get paid to look at the big picture and to keep constant track of the data coming in, the number of complaints, what kinds of complaints are coming in, and to change, to make those adjustments that they need to make midstream to meet the different challenges that are coming up.
Delbach, with reference to the report that you are addressing, you spoke a moment or two ago about the hostile attitudes that the police officers have, particularly when they come into the minority or African American community. A part of the problem, I would think, relates to the geographical aspects of how some of the police officers grow up. I would think that oftentimes they're not raised in a community where they're exposed to many minorities. They grow up, they go to school with majority white students, they go to white churches, they go to basically white social gatherings. They have very little contact as they grow up and become adults with the black community. In the meanwhile, there are many attitudes and much racism and other things that impact upon a police officer who's then given the responsibility of going into a community where he's mostly heard many bad things about the people there. Doesn't know them, never been to school with them, never socialized with them. And so it would seem to me that forms a kind of an attitude that he comes into that community with. Does the report address that, and is that a legitimate psychological area which should be addressed in terms of police training and community relations?
The report does talk about the issue of the distrust between the police officers and the community. And much of this is undeniably driven by the fact that there's a lack of familiarity too often between the community, between police officers and the communities they're charged with serving. And I might also add to that, that in addition to that, there's lack of familiarity the other way also, which is oftentimes people, once this thing starts spiraling, oftentimes people, I think, too often lump all police officers together in the same way, and I don't know that that's always the best way to do it either. Congressman, I think it would be incredibly valuable if we could find a way to make police officers, even if they're not part of that community, even if we can't do that, if we could do that, that would be great, but even if we can't do that, to have a real knowledge, a deep knowledge of the communities that they are out there serving and policing. I think that kind of familiarity would do worlds to improve the trust between the police and the community, because I think that both the community and the police would discover that there are, of course, bad apples, but the vast majority of people who live in these communities are really, in the long run, done right, going to be the allies of the police. They're going to be on their side because they want to be protected.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your testimony. I look forward to reading the 50-page report. My question would be along the lines of training, because that's come up several times in conversations. And I'm at a community college, St. Clair Community College in Dayton, and also we have a training. Do most of the officers go through a particular set of curriculum, either at the community college level or some academic experience? And then what is the state training? Is it just martial arts, or is it also dealing in some of the issues that you've been talking about, as relating, the Congressman was talking about, as it relates to community police relationships? So the training that you're talking a little bit more about.
So first of all, let me begin by saying that you have people who are on this commission, who work on this task force, who work with you, who will know far more about this topic than will I. So that internal resource is one that you ought to use. For every police officer, of course, there's a standard base level of training that they have to go through. Different departments fulfill it in different ways. Some of them have their own in-house training. Some of them work with the OPATA to do their training. Others work with local regional areas to do training. I know, for instance, here locally, Cleveland Heights runs a police academy that some of the neighboring municipalities also use. Then there's the in-service training. And again, there are some requirements that the state puts on in-service training with respect to categories of in-service training, just like lawyers like myself have to go through. There are some categories of training we have to go through every couple of years. But there's a lot of discretion, too, for individual departments on top of. So it's a mix of requirements and and discretion that individual departments have. And I would hasten to point out that the training that's required is only the baseline training, right? You can always provide more training to your workforce. And again, I would encourage you to talk to the experts here on the task force.
Just a quick question, U.S. Attorney. I want to follow up on something that the Congressman brought up. In terms of diversity, whether it's ethnicity diversity or gender diversity, what does that look like overall? You have lots of police departments under your watch. And even if you could speak about that more broadly, because some of what I've been hearing in the community and what I see firsthand, and goodness and a commitment to public service comes in all ethnicities and genders, so I want to lay that out there. But in terms of the real practical implications, because I think what the congressman is saying is really about people getting an understanding and a respect for one another. What does the diversity look like in police departments across this country, both from a racial, ethnic perspective and also a gender perspective too?
So the first question I'll answer that question is Senator Turner's. I don't know. I don't have the numbers in front of me to be able to tell you. I will tell you that my strong feeling is that diversity is an important and laudable goal that we ought to be trying to strive to reach in policing, especially, really in many professions, in my profession certainly in prosecution, but in policing we really ought to be striving to reach that because it will make our police departments better departments. I want to repeat a story that one of the ministers told to the Attorney General at a meeting that we had. One of the ministers from one of the large African American churches here said that he does a summer camp every summer for kids from the city. And they're 10-year-old kids, 11-year-old kids. He said, he'll sit down with them and talk about what they want to do, right? Give them some ideas and get some ideas. And he said, invariably, when he talks to these 10, 11-year-old kids, 70%, maybe more, want to be in criminal justice. They want to be police officers. And he asked a question to the Attorney General and to the mayor. He said, then fast forward 10 years, and these kids are now 20. None of them are police officers, and a bunch of them have been arrested. What is going on, that we cannot capitalize on that desire at that young age? What changes about people's attitudes towards law enforcement in these communities during that time? And what's causing it to change? That people don't want to do this anymore. And I think that was a really troubling and surprising question. If you think about it, a lot of people in communities of colors at a young age, they want to go into law enforcement. Why? What is going on in those? Is it bad community policing? Is it developing a distrust of the police? Is it an incident that they have with the police that sours them on law enforcement? And that's something I think that you ought to really look at.
Senator Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for your testimony. Can you share with us, during your investigation, how many cases did you look at, or how many incidents did you all look at, and over what period of time? And can you also give us a percentage of the number of cases that resulted in the unnecessary and excessive use of deadly force? What percentage were minorities? What percentage was white, Hispanics? If you could give us that breakdown.
So we looked at about 600 cases, maybe a little more. And we looked over a period of just over 2 years, but not 3 years. It was in the high 20s of months. I forget the exact number of months. And we did not conduct an inquiry. We did not do an investigation of profiling, so we did not conduct an inquiry. So I cannot give you the number of the breakdown of cases that involve people of different races.
Representative Williams. I'm sorry. Senator Williams, you have a follow-up, and Representative Reese.
Thank you very much. So you didn't record race in any of the cases that you looked at, or more?
That's right. That's right. We didn't break it down that way in our report. So I can't tell you one way or the other what it was. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the import of our findings and the feelings of the community. I've said this before, so I want to say it to you. It's undeniable that race is a very important part of what's going on, and we shouldn't shy away from that. I just don't have the numbers to answer your specific question.
Thank you.
Representative Reese.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask a question on a more of a broader sense. Obviously, you talked a lot about when you find a bad apple, and you have an investigation. The next step deals with the prosecution component, and I just wanted to know on a broader context of the Department of Justice, because one of the things that I'm certainly very worried about is people losing confidence in the system. Do you have any numbers or documentation dealing with, have we been able to indict any police officers in any of these cases? And if so, around the country? And if not, has your office looked into why? Because I know a lot of folks are looking at, we need the Department of Justice to come in here, and they begin to look at the grand jury process and feel as though they have lost confidence because it is a secret process. And so can you talk about that, and if there are any cases where you guys are coming in, into Ohio to deal with some of these issues?
Sure. This is actually, in sort of a legal, practical sense, something I do know a little bit about, because I spent most of my career as a prosecutor in one office or another handling police misconduct allegations. And so I can tell you that on the federal side, the federal law that exists to criminally prosecute a police officer for using excessive force is a law that is very, very narrow. It's 18 United States Code, Section 242.
Can you repeat that? It's very
Sure. 18 United States Code, Section 242. And on the federal side, that imposes on the prosecution the highest burden of intent known in the law. It's a specific intent requirement. So basically, you have to prove beyond any reasonable doubt, so that's the standard in criminal cases, to a unanimous jury that not only was the force excessive, that's not enough. You can prove the force was excessive, you can still lose the case. You have to also prove that at the time that the officer administered the force, that he or she knew that it was excessive, and they administered it anyway. So the officer, it would be a defense to that kind of a case, for instance, that the officer wrongfully but honestly thought that a person had a gun. That the officer wrongfully but honestly thought, even if his belief was, or her belief was unreasonable, that the person posed a threat to them. It's a very, very difficult statute. Now, in the state law, there are far more options for prosecutors in terms of bringing cases involving use of force incidents, because the state law has a menu of different intent levels that a prosecutor could choose from. And again, I defer to Prosecutor O'Brien here, who knows more about the state code than I ever will. But in most states, including Ohio, you have different degrees. You have murder 1, you have murder 2, you have involuntary manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, reckless homicide. You have a whole array of different intent levels. And right now in Cleveland, there's an indictment, pending indictment that's headed to trial, where there's an officer who used force who is being prosecuted under a manslaughter theory for a very, very prominent case here. And I don't want to comment on the merits of the case, but you asked things that have happened. Under the federal statute, Chief Navarre can tell you, we prosecuted the sheriff of Lucas County and 3 of his subordinates for the use of force involving an inmate at the Lucas County Jail. Several years ago, under that statute, we received convictions for 2 and acquittals for 2 of those individuals. That was a case where a chokehold was used and the inmate died. We've prosecuted officers in different municipalities around the district and are currently investigating others, but it's a very high standard in the federal law.
Thank you again so much for your time and your dedication to this matter. We certainly appreciate that. Any other questions from the task force members? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Now, we will now hear from David Kennedy. David Kennedy is the director of the Center for Crime Prevention and Control at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. He directed the Boston Gun Project, whose Operation Ceasefire intervention was responsible for more than 60% reduction in youth homicide victimization, and he also developed a high-point drug market intervention strategy. Both of these strategies have won numerous awards. He helped design and build the Justice Department's strategic approaches to community safety initiative, the Treasury Department's Youth Crime Gun Interdiction Initiative, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance Drug Market Intervention Program. Co-chair of the National Network for Safe Communities, an alliance of more than 50 jurisdictions dedicated to reducing crime, reducing incarceration, and addressing the racial conflict associated with traditional crime policy. I also want to point out that I've worked with David for several years. He's worked with our office. We've helped implement many of his strategies in cities across Ohio, and we've seen very similar results. I'm very pleased that David could be here. He actually was supposed to be someone else, but we twisted his arm a little bit, and he decided that he would come join us in Ohio. So I give to you David Kennedy.
Thanks, Carlton. I'm not only honored to be here, I'm really relieved to be here. So I want to thank the governor for making this happen, and for Carlton and OCJS, with whom I have a long and happy and productive relationship, for getting me here. And I want to thank the panel for your service beginning today and going forward. As far as I know, this is the only such state panel sitting on a statewide basis on these issues, and that's very, very important. And I want to tell you in any way that we can, those of us working on these issues outside Ohio will back you up, and I can't tell you how much we are grateful that you are entering the fray. It's been mentioned already that I am part of a very important, in our mind, Department of Justice initiative called the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. I am part of the outside team on that from my home institution of John Jay, UCLA, Yale Law School, and the Urban Institute in Washington that will be working with DOJ on that. I want to emphasize that today I am speaking in my own voice. There is actually a National Initiative event in Columbus tomorrow night, hosted by the Justice Department, for those who might want to continue this conversation in a slightly different vein, but today I'm speaking for myself as a faculty member at John Jay. So I have been doing work in the most troubled, mostly African-American communities in the country for about 30 years now. I am devoted to those communities. I am devoted to public safety because these communities suffer a kind of public safety crisis that prevent them from functioning well as communities. And these last couple of months have been extraordinarily intense and poignant for me and many of us in my world, because they are literally the best of times and the worst of times. They are the best of times because many of the public safety issues that have brought us to this work are dramatically better than they were not all that long ago. And I'm going to speak in a moment to the fact that they are not still nearly as improved as they need to be. But everybody in this room recognizes that we are in a continuing, now more than 20-year national crime decline. I am now a 10-year New York City resident. This is nowhere more evident than in New York City. People in my city, I deal with young students, they do not remember 1990 when New York City had nearly 2,400 homicides. Those of us standing there then and working on these issues nationally could not have imagined a time when, as in this last calendar year, New York City had only slightly more than 300 homicides. Nobody believed that that would happen. Nobody knew how to produce it. Nobody saw it coming. And we should be celebrating that. And instead, we are very properly having this conversation because we are at the same time in a very real national crisis of relationship between those very same communities and law enforcement. That crisis has been provoked by very particular incidents. Tamir Rice here in this city, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner again in my home city in New York. And in the work that we do, in the conversation that we have, these proceedings very typically go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the circumstances of those incidents and more like them. We look at what produced them, we look at how we assess them, we look at how we could have prevented them. We look even at whether there was anything wrong that happened. And this crisis, of course, has been deepened, exacerbated by the decisions in grand juries in both Ferguson and New York that in at least a formal legal sense, nothing wrong happened, which of course very many people very much disagree with. I want to make a plea here to this body not to get caught in the trap of going deeper and deeper and deeper into these incidents as the incidents that they are. The single most important fact that I have learned in 30 years of working in these neighborhoods is that when something like this happens, those of us on the outside focus on the incident, and people in the neighborhood focus on history. And I want to talk today not about the incidents, but about the grinding, perennial reality experienced by folks in these communities that provide the garden in which, when we have these incidents, we get these toxic blooms. I especially beg of this body not to do what so many others are doing and say, is there anything wrong here? Was there misbehavior? Did anybody behave badly? But to begin by recognizing how very much is wrong here, and that without any kind of clever unpacking of these incidents, we should know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is very much deeply, deeply wrong here. And I want, in that landscape, to identify three main issues. So, I said already, I work largely, and most of what we are now dealing with emanates in incident and sentiment from historically deeply troubled Black communities. I focus primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on serious violence. And in terms of homicide and gun violence, we are very honest about this. White folks have never dealt with these problems. It is no longer the case that neighborhoods of concentrated Latino population are predictors for high levels of violence. It used to be, not anymore. And that appears to be in large part because despite what the political debate would have, we are dealing with, of course, a wave of immigration. And that wave of immigration in newly settled communities is actually an insulator against violence. It is only now on a national basis, statistically, that poor, historically troubled African American neighborhoods are consistently places of high violence. And I said before, it's gotten better, that's correct. It is still the case that the violence experienced by these communities is not only extreme, it is, in my view, unconscionable. So the national homicide rate right now has come down to about 4 per 100,000. This is the way the FBI and criminologists track this. This is 4 homicide victimizations per 100,000 in the population every year. Our cities have neighborhoods where if you are a young black man, and this is overwhelmingly a young black man's problem, your homicide victimization rate is not 4 per 100,000, it is over 500 per 100,000 every year. For every one of those homicide victims, we statistically get 5 or 6 non-fatal woundings. So if you do the math, if you are a young man over some finite period of time, the likelihood that you will be shot and wounded or shot and killed is overwhelming. And these are the places where we have street shrines to the dead on the corners and RIP written on the buildings. In Newark, where I work, these are the neighborhoods where you can take a photograph of your son into a corner store and they will print you up RIP t-shirts with his picture. This is normal life in many of these places. Black men are 6% of the nation's population, roughly. They are 50% of the homicide dead. I don't know if any Ohio cities have ShotSpotter. Carlton would know. ShotSpotter, many of you will know, is a relatively recent innovation. It's an acoustic signaling system that picks up gunshots. It is far more accurate than the human ear or than reporting systems. As ShotSpotter has spread out nationally, it has found that in every city that they operate, 80 to 90% of gunshots are never called into 911. Nobody even picks up the telephone. And in the blazing hot spots that many urban areas have, where the gunfire is the most concentrated, people have so given up on getting any help with this that nobody calls the police. There are no 911 calls. If you haven't been part of this, you cannot imagine how bad it is. So I tell stories because the numbers don't penetrate. Here is a story. I was with a homicide investigator in Oakland, California, and one of his cases was a freeway-to-freeway shooting. Guys in one car had seen their enemies in another car. The guns came out. Driver in the second car was killed. Car crashed. His 16-year-old companion survived. And he knew who had shot his friend and tried to kill him. And so my homicide investigator friend was trying to crack the case, was interrogating him. He was not snitching. He was not giving his enemies up. And after banging on him for a while, the detective gave up and just said, I haven't said this. I am so sorry for your loss. And this stony, uncooperative gangbanger broke down in uncontrollable tears and said to this detective, at least my friend lived a full life. His friend was 21 years old. And that is the normal experience in many, many, many black neighborhoods in all of our cities. And I said, it is not just wrong, it is unconscionable, and I say that again. The fact that we have lived with this for all this time and think that it is normal is unconscionable. That's the first issue I want to talk about. The second is what I will call the unintended consequences of what we have been doing in criminal justice to address the first problem. These neighborhoods get a lot of attention because of the violence and related issues such as extraordinarily disorderly drug activity. They have been getting that kind of attention for decades now, and the result is that this America of ours has 5% of the world's population, 5% of the world's population, and 25% of its prisoners. There is a debate and scholarship about whether the number of people behind bars now in the U.S., which has risen to 2.3 million people, whether that number is a little bit larger or a little bit smaller than the height of the Soviet Gulag under Stalin. So if you could just take a moment with that. A little bit better or a little bit worse than Stalin. That's us right now today. Paul Butler is a black former prosecutor who is now a law professor at Georgetown University. Paul's done his own research and points out that a black man in the United States would have been at substantially, by a number of multiples, substantially lower risk of going to prison in 1960 before the Civil Rights Revolution than he is now. He would have been better off in terms of going to jail under Jim Crow. Again, if you're not in the thick of this, you cannot believe how bad it is. If you are a black man in the nation, not in one of these hotspot neighborhoods, but in the nation, and do not finish high school, your likelihood that you will go to prison is now 70%. And because we all know that the neighborhoods that I'm talking about are centers of school failure and all of that, going to prison is what happens to a young man. I work in places where basically all of the men have criminal records. If you are in Baltimore, or 10 years ago when they did this research, and you are a black male between the ages of 20 and 30, at any given moment, half of you are under criminal justice supervision, not have a criminal record. You are in prison, in jail, on parole, or on probation. If you are a black man in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, your lifetime risk of at least going to jail is now approaching 100%. And of course, this is not good for them, for their families, or their communities. There is an ever-growing body of formal research that says when this happens to the men and increasingly to the women in a community, you never get out from under your jail and prison term. The likelihood that you'll ever get a decent job goes down to next to nothing. You have no reason to invest in school or training. You can't get bonded. You can't pass a background check. It's not just you, it's your family. You are less likely to support your family. You're less likely ever to marry. Your sons especially are more likely to fail school and go to prison themselves. And there is a growing body of work that says communities where this is what people experience are less likely to cooperate with the police, they're less likely to call 911, they're less likely to serve on juries and convict, they are less likely to take part in the natural work of a community to prevent crime and interfere with your neighbor's kids when they're misbehaving. You are less likely to support the police and the legal system, and some of the most recent work says that even if you do not have a conviction yourself, even if you still have the franchise, you are less likely to vote. Because at root, being treated like this makes people feel like they're not citizens, and so they don't act like it. These are also the neighborhoods that experience the highest concentration of what they experience as disrespectful, sometimes illegal, and intrusive policing. So in the last 3 weeks, I have had multiple conversations behind closed doors with current law enforcement officials about clearing corners. These are the neighborhoods where law enforcement goes in, they see groups of young men congregating in public. On the corner, there is something in this thing we call the Constitution, which gives a right to free assembly. And those officers roll up on those young men and they get them out of there. I've worked in departments where formal activity reporting, clearing corners, is tracked as an output of the police force. These are the neighborhoods that have been the focus of the most intensive stop and frisk. Again, this is my home city of New York City, where I said crime has come down more than anywhere else for longer than anywhere else in the country. The result being that our last mayoral election turned on repudiating the techniques that the city said had produced that crime control, because the community doesn't like it. Paul Butler, again, my colleague at Georgetown Law, has a long story he tells about walking home to his house, coming back from the university. And he was followed by a marked car. The officers got out. They demanded to know who he was and what he was doing. They demanded that he give them identification. And he said, I don't have to. And they said, well, yes, you do. And he said, well, actually, I'm a professor of constitutional law. No, I don't. And he wouldn't do it. And they wouldn't let him go. And he sat on his front porch for hours while they stood there and watched him. And it was not until his neighbors came and vouched for him that they let him go. And what Paul doesn't say until the end of the story, and it will get to some of your comments earlier, both of those officers were black. And part of what I'm getting to is this is not nearly so much about race as we think it is. This is about the community and the police. And they're not getting along. Okay. High levels of violence, unintended damage caused by mass incarceration and intrusive law enforcement. Third issue, the broken relationship between those communities and law enforcement, especially the police. You have in Ohio, at Ohio State, a national treasure. You have Professor Michelle Alexander. So anybody working on these issues, and I commend this to the panelists, who has not read Michelle's book, The New Jim Crow, if there is one thing you need to read to understand this, it is The New Jim Crow. And The New Jim Crow is a meticulous, carefully documented, carefully reasoned argument that the criminal justice system as it exists in America today is a deliberate government conspiracy configured to do America's black neighborhoods and black people harm under color of law. And if you are in these neighborhoods, this is what a substantial portion of the population believes. And the argument is that none of this is an accident. The high levels of violence, the high levels of incarceration, the disrespectful policing, none of it is an accident. That all the young men are going to prison, that people are getting shot, that the drugs are there, not because nobody can stop it, but because that is what the government and the police and the prosecutors and the prison system wants. And that it is in that way no different than what this country has done to black Americans from before the founding of the nation, through transportation, through slavery, through slave catching, through Reconstruction, through the black codes, through Jim Crow, through the dogs and the fire hoses set on civil rights marchers, through COINTELPRO. I asked a room, one of my classrooms recently, if anybody knew what COINTELPRO was, and nobody in the room knew. COINTELPRO was the FBI's sanctioned, internally sanctioned effort led by J. Edgar Hoover to penetrate the civil rights movement and to use surveillance to try to drive Martin Luther King out of the civil rights movement and to suicide. They really did that, that's true. So when my friends who don't get this look at me and say, the new Jim Crow, that's nuts, the government would never do that, my response is, well, yes, they did. And exactly at the moment when the formal law changed with the civil rights revolution of the early 1960s, that is precisely when we started locking everybody up under the guise of drug and gang enforcement. And we end up in Paul Butler's position where, in terms of criminal justice contact, our young black men and our older black men would have been better off then than they are now. So I disagree with Michelle about one important thing. I agree with her about the impact and how awful it is and how destructive it is. I agree with her about all of it. The one thing I disagree with her about is that it's a conspiracy. I don't think it is. I think it's a lot of things, but I don't think it's that. But I also believe that if we were trying to look as if we had replaced our old racism with a new racism, we could hardly do any better than we're doing. And what we know is that if enough people in the neighborhoods believe that, then they will not believe in the police, they will not work with the police, they will not snitch. People think stop snitching is about witness intimidation. It's not. There is a certain amount of that out there, but that's not what's driving the movement. What's driving the movement is what's becoming an increasing norm in these neighborhoods, these communities, that good people don't work with the police. And they're not afraid. They are angry and they are withdrawing and they are separating. And we now know that when what the social science literature is now calling legitimacy, the belief on the part of the public that the police and criminal justice are fair, not racist, treating them with respect, acting in their best interest, when that feeling of illegitimacy goes up, crime goes down. Most people obey the law because they feel it's the right thing to do most of the time. Even most criminals do. Most criminals buy most of what they get. They don't run red lights. They don't shoot people most of the time, right? Even bad guys are good guys most of the time. When that feeling of legitimacy goes down, crime, and especially serious violent crime, goes up. And what we are dealing with in very real fact in neighborhoods all across the country is a crisis of legitimacy. And to go back to where I started, it is not just because of Tamir Rice. It is not just because of Michael Ferguson. It is not just because of Eric Garner. It is because of the everyday toxic experience that is normal life in these places. So we are not going to fix this by looking at just training and just recruiting and just diversity and grand jury protocols and all that kind of thing. We have to recognize that if we don't deal with the violence, the prison, and legitimacy, we are not going to deal with this. So, there is actually very good reason to be optimistic about this. Lots of people have been working on this for a long time. The DOJ initiative is building on that work. There's lots to be drawn from here. And I want to close with some of those areas that I would commend to your consideration and attention. In my mind, the single most important one is don't assume racism. We have been going to racism for generations, and there was absolutely a time when that was the right place to go. If you are embedded in law enforcement these days, you find very little in terms of overt racism. There's racism everywhere. Everybody knows that. Is racism what is driving these incidents as a set of incidents? Is it what is driving these grinding everyday issues? It is not anymore. So when you talk to the officers who go into these neighborhoods and clear the corners, of course the community experiences that as racism. But if you sit with the men and women who do that, they are trying to save community people's lives. They don't know what else to do, and that's what they're doing. And many of them will tell you behind closed doors to your face, we know it's illegal. Of course we know that, but we don't know what else to do. In fact, I would commend to you the idea that there is in fact tremendous goodwill on both sides. There is hiding behind our conflict and our anger a tremendous common ground. Nobody likes the violence. Nobody. The police have been saying forever, we can't arrest our way out of this. They know that that's not going to work. Prosecutors are starting to say the same thing. They don't like having a broken relationship with the neighborhood. They are desperate for ways to build bridges, as are people in the community. The survey research on this can be absolutely fascinating because the same surveys, one question will be, do you trust the police? And 80% of people will say no, and a page later it will be, what do you think we should do about crime in your neighborhood? And the answer will be, we want more police. Those are not incompatible ideas. What the communities desperately want is a different kind of law enforcement. And part of what's so optimistic right now is that some of those new ways are emerging. But as I look at the moment that we're in, and it scares me witless, one of the things that I find the most painful is that we have gotten very, very good in this moment that we're in at judging each other by the worst things that we do. And most of what the community does every day is good stuff. Most of what the police do every day is good stuff. And if we focus on that common ground, it is there to be built on. I think that any way of moving forward on this has to respect the nature of serious crime in these places. And the nature of serious crime in these places is that a tiny and distinct fraction of the community is overwhelmingly responsible for the violent crime. And the terrible mistake we've made in much of our law enforcement is to focus on the neighborhood and not on that very small fraction. It's amazingly small. So when you get down to those at most risk for killing somebody, for being killed, and they're the same people, and for driving the worst drug crime and all of that, it is literally 1% of the young men in the neighborhood. Not the community, not everybody with a criminal record, not everybody who listens to gangster rap. 1% of the roughly 18 to 26-year-olds. And what we've done in many of these communities is set up at one end and roll through to the other, and we turn everybody upside down. The 1% see us coming and go inside, and by the time we're done, we've done little to address crime and everything to alienate the neighborhoods. And there are ways to do better. Cincinnati has modeled this for the country. The Cincinnati Initiative to Reduce Violence is built on exactly this focus on the impact players. And we've been operating in Cincinnati long enough to know now that when CERV has been healthy, crime goes down. When CERV gets weak, crime goes right back up. They put it back together this last year. Cincinnati is at historic low levels of violence at the end of 2014. So the fact that in what we regard as the most dangerous places, nearly everybody is not part of the problem, needs to inform the way we do criminal justice. And again, we're beginning to figure out how to do that. The national initiative, which has been mentioned a couple of times, is built around three ideas. It is built around the idea of reconciliation. So this is not what we normally think of as criminal justice practice or crime control or reform. It is built on the idea that increasingly senior figures in law enforcement in this country are willing to go to the public and say things very much like what I said at the beginning of my remarks. We have a long and toxic and real history of constitutional racism in this country. It lasted until the early 1960s, not that long ago. I work with people who were present when their grandparents were lynched. This is not ancient in any way. We have done things that have done unintended harm. We have done things that have in fact been illegal, and we have done things that have been disrespectful. And we are going to own all of that, and we are committing to doing better, but we're not going to pretend it didn't happen. And we want to work with you differently, and we expect new things out of you too, but we're going to start by saying we've done wrong. The sheriff who now runs, or who last year ran, the police department in Alabama, whose officers went to the bus station where surviving civil rights legend John Lewis went during the Selma March and beat him at an anniversary observance of that incident without telling anybody, stood on the dais next to John Lewis and said, "My department did that. None of us serving today were any part of that, but it was my agency, it was my institution, and I am going to tell you it was wrong. We were wrong, you were right." And I want to make it real clear that we all knew this, and he took his badge off and he gave it to John Lewis. And John Lewis took it and wept and said, in all the time since we were attacked 50 years ago, nobody in law enforcement has ever said that was wrong, and we're sorry, and it's all he needed to hear. So, let's own our history and be honest about it. Second of these big ideas, and my colleague Tracy Kesey is with me, this is work that she's done for years, is the notion of implicit bias. We're all biased. We can't help it. It's the way our brains work. And in these settings, bias can produce behavior that looks like racism, tastes like racism, produces outcomes just like racism, but it's not driven by racists. And we now know that we can test for this, we can identify it, and it's beginning to look like we can help people not do it. And a huge amount, we know this now, of what we in the community has read as outright traditional Lester Maddox racism is not that kind of racism, it's other kinds of bad behavior, and we can aspire to fixing it. Third big idea is procedural justice. And that is the fact, and it is a fact, that how we are treated in encounters with the police, with law enforcement, actually matters to most of us most of the time more than what actually happens. It's not whether we get the ticket. It's whether the trooper is respectful. They can be abusive, let us go, and we hate them more than if we had been cited. We all know this. And the same's true, as it turns out, even with very serious offending. So there's a curriculum that the Chicago Police Department is putting essentially all of its serving officers through. This is not for academy trainees. This is for seasoned law enforcement. And there is a moment in this training where the Chicago police officers who are teaching this course say to their peers, people in the community hate us. We know that. We experience it every day. We don't understand it because we know why we're out there. We know we're not racists. We know why we came on the job. We know why we show up every day. We will literally take a bullet to keep them alive, and they hate us. And so the trainers say, think about this. Think about the last time you were at a homicide scene. So there's a victim on the ground, maybe the forensics people are going over him. We're on our side of the yellow tape, and his girlfriend and kids and mother and father and grandparents and neighbors and friends, they're on the other side. And they're looking at us across the crime scene tape. And the trainers say to their peers, what do they see? And you ask this question in any room full of law enforcement, and the serving cops blanch. And they say, they see us laughing. because that's what cops do at homicide scenes. I heard this and I blanched because I've done it myself. It's what first responders do, surgeons and EMTs and trauma nurses. It's black humor. It's how you keep your head about you. It's how you don't drink yourself to death and eat your gun. But they suddenly realized what people who already thought that they were racist pigs saw. They see them laughing over their dead loved ones. And now they don't laugh at dead loved ones at the Chicago Police Department anymore. All right? So, I'm done now. This is an extraordinary opportunity to get this right. Getting it right is not about the incidents. You have to do that, right? We need that. But the incidents mean what they mean in the community because the community is experiencing unconscionable levels of violence and jail and what they regard as abuse. There actually begin to be ways out of this. And in my mind, I want to end on this note. So yesterday was Martin Luther King's birthday. It's not just a day off. This is the critically important work, unfinished, of dealing with this country's toxic racial legacy. We've gone a long way to getting the statutes right. But what we do within the formally equal law of the United States is not equal. And that is a matter not only of continued statutory attention, but of practice and institutional reform and, I truly believe, reconciliation work. What we are talking about here is a failure of the American democratic experiment. And there is nothing good about the string of homicides that have brought us to this room. But if this actually becomes the moment where we take this seriously and make real headway on it, let's seize it.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, so much, both for your presentation and also your time, and as importantly, for adjusting your schedule to be in this great state of Ohio. Questions from the task force?
Representative Reese. Thank you for your testimony. And you had mentioned, I know the task force here today, and you mentioned that certainly we need to look at the broader reform of the justice system. And I know that our chairperson and our two co-chairs, Colonel Bourne and former Senator Nina Turner and Senator now, Sandra Williams, I know that was an issue when we talked with the governor on this. And certainly the incidents of Tamir Rice and John Crawford and what's happening across the country where black and white and brown are in the streets protesting brings us today with an opportunity to come up with some clear-cut, actionable steps. In your research, and I appreciate your 30 years in the African-American community and certainly something that many of us on this panel, we live every day, can you tell us some actionable steps that you're doing with the DOJ? I understand you say you have some funding or some kind of programming. What are some actionable steps that you could maybe present to us or help us in your experience with this issue that we might be able to take a look at today that the DOJ is doing through your work that we might be able to do with this task force? You bet. So let me again separate myself from the DOJ umbrella at this moment. The work for that is charted, but it is only just getting underway. So let me instead talk about what we know can be done right now. And I firmly expect the DOJ work to add to this portfolio
meaningfully and quickly. But let me begin with the existing body. So in terms of addressing serious violent crime in the community in a way that actually strengthens the community and greatly reduces these other unintended harms. Let me look again to the Cincinnati Serve model. Carlton will be able to give you the current roster of cities elsewhere in Ohio that is doing that kind of work, both through OCGS and I believe through the Attorney General's office. We know for a fact now that we can engage with that small, very small population that is at extremely high risk, build direct contact and direct relationships with them, broker customized social services to them, set them up in very distinct relationships with elders in their own community, put them on prior notice of their legal risks, and help them off the corner, help them comply with community standards, and on a good day, not only bring the violence down, but actually put a lot less of them in jail and prison. So there's a range of those. Some are focused on gangs, some are focused on gun markets, some are focused on individual violent offenders, some are focused at folks with records of gun offending, but they all exist. Most of them have been meticulously evaluated. They have a very strong outcome record, and OCGS and others can steer you to those. So that's off-the-shelf stuff right now. In the procedural justice legitimacy sphere, there are training curricula for line officers. There are modules for academies. There are more customized workshops for executives and command staff. There are ways of teaching officers in their day-to-day encounters, not just in these critical situations, but in their everyday work, how to act with transparent respect rather than giving offense, how to talk to people, how not to talk to people, as the U.S. Attorney said, actual mechanisms for de-escalation rather than escalation. That is a growing portfolio because the attention to legitimacy and procedural justice is growing pretty much in real time, but that's all out there. It's been audited. We and others can help steer the committee to that. I think the area that I highlighted where we have both the greatest hope and the least detailed experience is what I called reconciliation work. So this is having people in positions that folks like us inhabit go to angry neighborhoods, acknowledge history, acknowledge the legitimacy of much of their discontent, owning that and working with them, not to undo it because we can't undo it, but to figure out how we can collectively move forward. We've got examples of that around the country. My office at John Jay, separate from the Justice Department, has been driving quite a bit of this work. Some of the basic directions on that are, I think, now clearly understood and desperately in need of more partners, more field work, more real community experience. And maybe I'll stop there.
We have Senator Roberts and then Pastor Lynch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kennedy, I've followed some of your writings before as it relates to trust building in communities, and I've read Michelle Alexander's comments on Jim Crow. What I'm having a trouble clearly understanding, and I think I do, but I want to make sure I understand it. We all understand who grew up or in the black community, the violence, the activity that's going on in our communities, and as you pointed out to us, mothers putting their babies in tubs so they're not victims of the gunfire. What does that conflict in the black community have to do with community-police relations? Because that's where I'm not making the contact. I understand what's going on in the community. What I don't understand clearly is what that has to do with when the African American or the black community, the poor community comes in contact with law enforcement.
So we're beginning to think it's got everything to do with it. So the old frame for what you and I are talking about is community relations or public relations or community service officers or something like that. And again, as the U.S. Attorney said, we've viewed that as a kind of, fringe adjunct to the real work of doing law enforcement. And everything we're beginning to understand about this says that was exactly wrong. So one of the dominant drivers of the violence in the neighborhoods that we're both talking about, it's retaliatory, right? People think it's about money and protecting drug corners. Very little of it is actually about money. It is overwhelmingly about, he hurt my friend and I'm with him, so I have to do something about it, and I do something about it, and now it's coming back in the other direction. These cycle on literally for multiple decades. And what we're now, many of us working on this are not that bright, right? And we're the first to say so. What we're finally seeing is, if you know who shot your friend, you have a perfectly substitutable choice to make. You can call 911, work with the police, and get the guy taken off the street and prosecuted. Or you can get a gun in your friends and you can go deal with it yourself. And if you have the conviction about the police that many in the community have, especially the most active street guys, that they will not help you, that they don't like you, that they're racist, that they want to hurt you, you are not going to call them. You're going to get a gun in your friends and you're going to go be part of that never-ending cycle of retaliation. In my earliest work in Boston, 20 years ago now, Richie Skinner, who was a long-serving probation officer, told a story about seeing a kid he knew tearing off home with fire in his eyes, and he stopped the kid and said, "What's going on?" The kid was real honest. He said, "I'm going home to get my gun. I was just on a bus, somebody stole my chain, I know who it was, he won't give it back, and I'm going to go get my gun." And Richie said to him, "Wait a minute, bad idea. I'll get the cops to get it back for you." And the kid looked at him with utter astonishment and said, "Oh, they do that? That's fine." It never occurred to him, literally never occurred to him, that the police would help someone like him. So it's just that direct, right? If we fix the legitimacy problem, the idea that all of us carry around, that the police are there to help us if we need it, becomes something that's there for everybody. And right now, it's not there for everybody.
Good, thank you. Thanks, Chairman.
Pastor.
Madam Chair, Brother Kennedy, thank you for your testimony. And I appreciate you giving us some of the root causes of violence, which can be many: education, economics, broken families. But what drove me here today from Cincinnati was not a discussion on violence in communities. What drove me here today from Cincinnati was the death of Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, neither of which, John Crawford III in Beaver Creek, Ohio, had anything to do with violence in community. So when you talk about the small percentage of people in community that commit crime, today I'm discussing the small percentage of officers who unjustifiably take people's lives. And I think that's where our focus is, and I understand root causes, so I'm not negating anything you said, because there are many more root causes to violence in community. I understand the SERVE model. I actually trained the SERVE people in the city of Cincinnati, and it came out of our collaborative agreement, which I don't think you and I see eye to eye totally on that, but that's okay as well. But right now, what people are marching in the community, and they should possibly be marching every other day because of whatever violence that takes place, but they're marching because of that small percentage of officers. And you mentioned earlier about faith, or maybe I wrote about faith in the system. When violence takes place in the community, people are caught, they're punished, they're arrested. What upsets the community is that when officers unjustifiably take lives, too often they're not punished. And so then people lose even more faith in the system. So again, I appreciate your work, your history, your root causes, but if we meet I think it does a disservice to the community if the discussion that brought us here turns into a discussion on violence in community and doesn't focus on the violence perpetrated by the officers that got us here today.
So first, good to see you again.
You too. You too.
So I didn't think so I'll get to your question in a second, but just in case I wasn't clear about this, I didn't think I was talking about violence in the community. I thought I was talking about those who are paid to prevent violence in community not doing so, right? And as far as I'm concerned, that's on us. So that's what I was trying to say.
Well, then I apologize, because actually, to be honest, on this end, we missed like a few.
Well, that's what I meant.
All right. Okay.
So I don't want to talk about any of the particular incidents that have driven the troubles and this panel, because I don't know enough about them to say what I'd like to say. So I'm going to talk about something in the abstract. That many of the moments that produce the dead young men in the communities come out of the way that those neighborhoods are policed. And if one was in a different neighborhood, like a white, well-off neighborhood, and you were walking down the center of the road and a patrol car rolled up behind you, you would not be treated as you are in the neighborhoods we're talking about. You would not, on the receiving end, feel about that as you do if you're a young man in the neighborhoods we're talking about. You would not know uncountable numbers of friends and family who had been treated in similarly disrespectful and often, I'm clear about this, illegal ways. And the officer doing that with you would not be in the state of fear and tension that many officers in those neighborhoods are in. So I think that the potential for so much of what ends up with dead civilians is rooted in what I was talking about earlier. People are angry, they have been abused, they are experiencing a continuation of a very long community collective memory of abuse. Their community has been damaged by arrest and jail and prison, and that becomes a very seriously heightened environment in which occasionally extraordinarily bad things happen, in addition to the every day-to-day more mundane bad things. So I don't think they're separate. I think they're very closely linked.
Senator.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have been approached by constituents within my district about the grand jury process. Can you tell me what your opinion is on whether we should have a grand jury process, a secret grand jury in the state of Ohio? I know the dynamics of it and it has to be changed through the Supreme Court, but do you think we should get rid of that process and just require the prosecutor to take these types of cases dealing with police officers straight to trial? Or do you think it should be an open process, or do you think we should get rid of it overall, seeing that 26 states don't even have a grand jury, or approximately 26 states?
I have no idea. And I spent all day a couple of days ago sitting in a closed-door meeting of elected district attorneys from around the country. They spent half of it debating exactly this question, and I think both they and I ended up more confused than when we'd started. I have no idea how to cut that one.
Doctor?
Yes. Mr. Kennedy, thank you for your testimony. I have followed your work closely over the years, and I know that this is not the first time you've come to our city, come to Cleveland. I think you were here in the mid-2000s. And I was wondering, given where we are today in the city, what challenges would you see in implementing the type of strategies that you employ in other cities across the state and the nation here in our city? And if you could, speak to your experience when you came here in the 2000s.
Pass.
You will pass.
But let me talk more generically. And what every city that is serious about this needs is the genuine and really, uncompromising commitment from especially the police department. This is not just about the police. It's about prosecutors and the bench and corrections, but the fact is, it's the police that the community sees every day more than anything else. And in my view, so far anyway, it's the police that across the country have demonstrated the most willingness to be self-critical and to make changes. So at least right now, the police are the first among equals among criminal justice. So you need uncompromising commitment from the command staff and the police department. You need the same thing from mayors, city managers, at least some critical mass of elected officials. And really, if you've got that, you're going to be okay. And I do not mean to diminish the importance of the role of the community in all this, but our experience nationally is that you can always work with the community for all of what we see as anger and alienation and disenfranchisement. The goodwill on the part of a critical mass of people in the community, if you go to them and say, we really, really, really want to do differently here, they will meet you more than halfway. I've never seen anything otherwise. So I've come to count on that goodwill. You can't guarantee that from, and this is back to what I was trying to communicate around what are my exchange with Reverend Lynch. You can't count on that from the people who get paid to do this stuff, and you really need it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, so much. We want to make sure that we stay on time. The community has been so patient as you listen to both of our experts give some very valuable advice and recommendations and just really shaping this discussion. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break, and then we will reconvene at 6:30, at which time the community members will have the opportunity to address the task force. So thank you so much. We'll be back here promptly at 6:30.